Well, good evening. Always a pleasure to be here. Welcome to everyone who's joining us here, and welcome to everyone who's joining us online tonight. So we're carrying on with our series called A Journey to Faith, and tonight's lesson is lesson number 74. It's called Esther and Mordecai Save the Jewish Nation. I'm going to ask the question, the title of the book which this is coming from that I've written is called A Journey to Faith. Does anyone have any understanding why we would call it a journey to faith when we're basically following the genealogy of Jesus? So what is the genealogy of Jesus? And so we'll pop that up on the portion up on the screen behind. But what actually is the genealogy of Jesus? Why is it that the very first thing that you read in the New Testament is the genealogy of Jesus? Why is it so important?
Well, it's a prophecy.
Right? So prophecy? Saviour?
The whole history points towards Jesus. Everything went up to him and to him.
So from the end of chapter 11 we pick up with Abraham in the Bible, formerly called Abram. Mm-hmm. And Abraham is known as what's his name? What is he remembered as? Father of the faithful. Okay, so the genealogy of Jesus starts with Abraham, the father of the faithful, the man who God called out of ancient Ur, which is in southern Iraq today, and made a people of his own. And then the genealogy follows all the way through to the time of Jesus. And of course, Jesus is the end of the prophecy, if you will, or the fulfilment of the covenant that was originally made with Abraham. And so when we take this extraordinary long journey following this, we're basically going through 2,000 years of history to see the fulfilment of Jesus the Messiah coming after the initial calling of Abraham himself. And so it's an epic journey, and it's a journey. So why is it a journey to faith? Why is the genealogy a journey?
Because multiple things happened along the way.
Right. And so there was a time when God obviously knew before it happened what was going to happen. There was nobody who was going to stand for the Lord the right way. Some people did, but they all had their failings. Nobody was perfect, was it? There was no one who was without sin. So we could lift up someone like King David as an incredible man, but he too sinned, didn't he? And so Jesus was the only person to have a fleshly nature, to be tempted and yet not to sin. Abraham, who was called out, he was given multiple tests when the Lord first called him out to see if he was going to be faithful. And so throughout this journey we find that some are faithful and some are less faithful and some are downright not faithful at all. In fact, they walk away from the Lord altogether. And so we arrive at this point in time that we're following at the moment, and we're between verses 12 and 17 of Matthew chapter 1, which the genealogy of Jesus is there. And we're now following this descendant, Abiud, who is the son of Zerubbabel, who was the person who led the Jews back into Jerusalem. And Zerubbabel was the descendant of Shealtiel, who was born as the son of Jeconiah or Jehoiakim. And so these two were born in Jerusalem. Shealtiel was born in Jerusalem, as I mentioned. Zerubbabel was the only descendant who was born in Babylon, and then of course Abiud is the son of Zerubbabel. So that's the era of time that we're in. Now, during the life of Abiud, who comes up on the screen here on the left in this lime green colour, when we follow the history, we've got the tail end of the Babylonian Empire here, which is finished. And over here we've been reading in the time up to the end of Nehemiah in Darius the Great, who's throughout the scriptures in Nehemiah. And then now suddenly when we go to the book of Esther, we move on to a new leader or new ruler of the empire, and his title is Xerxes I. He's just known as Xerxes in the Bible, which we've discussed as a titular name. And so tonight I'm going to first off say exactly who he is. He is a historically real person. Now, the Jewish people, of course, are living in the Persian province called Yehud Medinata. Yehud, Persian for Jews. Medinata, as we mentioned before, representing the fact that they're beside the Mediterranean Sea there. and then to get an overall look at the empire, the yellow area defines everywhere that's part of the Persian Empire at the largest size that it ever grew to. And so that was under the rule of Darius I, or Darius the Great, who we've been following to now. Now we move into Xerxes. He inherits the largest size the Persian Empire ever was. And of course we move into the story of the time of Esther. And so we're going to have a look at this. Now Xerxes himself, as I said, this is a relief, a carving of him in one of the palaces, and this is the carving or the relief of Darius the Great. Xerxes' name is actually this name here, which I might challenge someone to pronounce, but I feel it says Khashayarshah, and we see that there's components within this name. So if we go and we have a look at Iran, for example, up until the middle of the last century, we find that they used to still have kings. And what was the name of a king in Iran? They were known as a Shah. S-H-A-H. And so we find here, I'll just come on this other side, that if we break up this name, the title name, Xerxes, is not a real name. It's actually a title name. It actually means ruling over heroes. This component of the name, Khashayarshah, means brave or strong, and Shah means king. So we can interpret his title name as the brave king who rules over heroes, or the strong king who rules over heroes. And so that's the explanation of his name. We may realise from the Bible, most ancient names actually represent or describe a place or a type of person or one of their attributes that's there. So King Xerxes, as we're beginning with tonight, he began his reign by immediately suppressing a revolt in Egypt and appointing his brother Achaemenes as the satrap, so that's the governor, to retain control. Now he followed a religion, we mentioned this in an earlier lesson, called Zoroastrianism. And the Astrianism is because they follow the stars. Okay? So these was one of their primary religions. And so a lot of the countries that they were ruling over, of course, didn't believe the same thing, didn't follow the same practices. And so we find that the previous rulers, Darius and King Cyrus, for example, they were quite happy to let everybody just believe what they believed. As long as they paid their taxes, sent some men to fight for them, everything was okay. But King Xerxes didn't share the same religious tolerance. And so in 484 BC, he infuriated the Babylonians. He had formerly governed by forcefully taking their huge golden statue of Marduk. So we might remember this from the biblical story. There was a golden statue that was built on the plains of Dura outside the ancient city of Babylon. And so here's a nice picture. Marduk was the name of their god. What's the other name in the Bible for Marduk? I mentioned this. It's only mentioned twice. It's only called Marduk once in the Bible, but he's called by the other name twice in the book of Daniel. And his name is Bel, B-E-L-L. And the reason is because he was considered so holy that you weren't allowed to say his name the same way the Jewish people would spell the word God with a G, lowercase slash D. They don't actually pronounce the word. And so they wouldn't say the word Marduk, so they called him Bel. Now the scripture that this comes from is from Daniel 3:1, and it says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. We know the story of the 3 Jewish government officials who went into the fire, and the Lord was in there with them and they came out unscathed. So this is the story of this golden statue. Now that's a biblical story, isn't it? That's where you know it from. Here in history we find that this ruler actually did something about this statue. So it wasn't just a biblical story, it's actually recorded in history. And so I love to find things in history which support the truth of the Bible. And so what did he do with this statue? He decided it was worth a lot. He didn't believe in Marduk, so he thought he would melt it down for the cash. And so he wanted the gold. So when I had a look at this, I'm always fascinated by this. This statue in the Bible, it talks about its height in feet or in meters, or in the original measurements. But if we have a look at this in metres, it turns out this statue is approximately 27 metres high, 2.7 metres wide, which equates to 1,407 tonnes of gold. Today, I checked this yesterday, that's worth US $6.5 billion. And so you can imagine these ancient times, this king comes into power and says, I'll take that, I'll melt it down, that'll fund the things that I want to do. $6.5 billion. And so this is recorded in history. So that was the end of that statue in the plain of Dura that we found in the book of Daniel. And so what do you think the Babylonians thought about that? They weren't very happy because that was their god. And so it caused a problem. So they actually rebelled against this new king, and he sent in his army, as they do, to crush the rebellion. And so that's how he started his reign. He crushed the rebellion in Egypt, he crushed the rebellion in Babylon. This is very normal when new kings take over. People like to test the new king to see if they're going to continue ruling over them, and normally there's always rebellions happen when a new king takes over. And so the relationship between the Babylonians and King Xerxes was so fractured that he refused to uphold his father's title of King of Babylon. So King Darius I, King Cyrus, they were all called King of Babylon because it was part of their empire. It was one of the names that they used. But when you read the book of Esther, if you go right through the whole book, you'll find that nowhere does Xerxes' title, King of Babylon, come into play. He refuses to use the title. And so instead, he preferred to be called the King of Persia and Media, in addition to Great King, King of Kings, and King of Nations, and Pharaoh of Egypt. And so this point of difference, as I've mentioned, you'll find in the Bible. So in the book of Nehemiah, the only title given to King Darius was actually the King of Babylon. So if you read through the book of Nehemiah, only the King of Babylon. When we read the book of Esther, King Xerxes is only associated with Persia and Media. And so in Esther chapter 1, verse 3, I've got a few examples here. So they're just snippets to explain this. It says the military leaders of Persia and Media. Esther chapter 1, verse 3. Esther chapter 1, verse 18, it says Persian and Median women. In Esther 1, verse 19, the next verse, it says laws of Persia and Media. And in Esther chapter 10, skipping a few chapters, verse 2, it says, and the annals of the kings of Media and Persia. So they're the writings of what the events that happened during each year. And so all the way through the book of Esther, we see they only reference Media and Persia. And so it makes sense, doesn't it? He burnt down the statue, he doesn't like them, and so his identity is not aligned with that of the Babylonians. And so he shows a difference in his character to previous rulers. So with the exception of suppressing these initial revolts, the transition from father to son was relatively smooth, and it was a testament to the reign of King Darius that his son, King Xerxes, inherited the empire at its greatest and largest size. Little change with the new administration, but the great satrapy, which was called Babylonia and Ebenari, which is in your scriptures there, which incorporated Mesopotamia and most of the Levant, was split into two. And so I'll just pop up a map. This is one I provided of this region before. So in the Bible, in the book of Nehemiah, we kept reading about the Trans-Euphrates, which they used to call the West Euphrates because it's to the west of the Euphrates River. So their centre was over here. Now, in this this description of Ebenari, this satrap or government area here actually included all of this Babylonian area as well. And so it was separated into two separate areas, and it became known as the West Euphrates or the Trans-Euphrates. And so this is what it was called in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. It's like a little bit of biblical tidying up the closet, isn't it? All these names and terminologies. But you realise when you read the Bible that all of these names and terminologies tell us something about what was going on at the time. So this satrapy, of course, included the sub-province of Judea, which is of course where Jerusalem is located over here. Now King Darius had died during his preparations to send a second army to the mainland of Greece. We spoke about this in the previous lesson. So as his son, he was determined to punish those from Athens, Naxos and Eritrea for helping the Ionians to revolt and burn the city of Sardis, the city that not only marked the end of the royal road from Persia's ceremonial capital Persepolis, I'll just put this up and come back to this in a moment, but from which his uncle ruled the region as satrap. He was also determined to punish those responsible for the defeat suffered by the Persians at a place called Marathon. So all of this is all going off over this area here. And so the Greeks are over here, the Persians have gone into part of the traditional regions of Macedonia, Thrace and Greece, and there's conflicts coming out of this region here. The Greeks went across the water and defeated the Persians. And so the Persians, with the new king, he's there to flex his muscle and say, look, we're going to come and we're going to show you what to do. So we're going to come about a new battle. Now, when the Persian Empire was first formed under Cyrus the Great, it was originally subdivided into 26 provinces or satrapies, so you can read that in your Bible. But under the reign of King Darius I, considerable expansion of the empire created the need to form many new satrapies. And so we go to the book of Esther, and you go to the very first verse in Esther 1, chapter 1, verse 1. It actually says that when King Xerxes ascended the throne, that he ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. And so India over here, Kush is off the bottom of the map here, so there's Libya, Egypt, and Kush, which is today's Sudan or Ethiopia, those regions down there. Okay, so that means that this whole territory was split from 26 into 127, which means that the size of the empire had grown as they divided it up. So the Bible gives us all this information, which again we can check in history. So after King Darius built the palace cities of Persepolis and Susa, the king and his court moved between cities depending on the season. And so in autumn and winter, they spent them in Babylon, here. And then in spring, his favourite place was Susa, which is where the story of Esther is located, and Mordecai. Summer they spent in Ecbatana, which is the former Media. And obviously this king talks about how he is the ruler of the Persians and the Medians. And the national holidays were celebrated at a ceremonial palace in this place called Persepolis. And when new kings were inaugurated, they actually went to this place called Pasargadae. And so all of these locations with these red dots on here are all locations which the king would frequently rotate around depending on what was going on and what season it was in the year. But the story of Esther and Mordecai is set here because this is their capital city, this is their administration city. So in 483 BC, the king began to prepare his retaliatory expedition to punish the Greeks. He invited princes, nobles, officials and military leaders to his palace in Susa where he resided. So you might wonder, why am I explaining all of this? And so if you go to your Bible in Esther chapter 1 again, and you now go to verses 2 to 3, I've just provided you with the historical background along with some scripture that tells you why this verse is here. And it reads, "At that time King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign he gave a great banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders," the scriptures say, "the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present." So in other words, he called them all in. Why? Because he's going to go to war. And so he calls everybody in for this reason. So the invited guests had been there, it says, for 180 days, half a year. So it's quite a party. Half a year. Imagine being invited to a party that went for half a year at the expense of the king. I think I could manage that. And they were there for that period of time before he actually gave the final banquet. Not only did he display, it says in Esther chapter 1 verse 4, the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendour and glory of his majesty, but he was also there to hold strategic discussions to develop plans to punish the Greeks who had humiliated his father, King Darius. And so we get a bit of the understanding of why the book of Esther opens here. So we're going to read from verses 6 to 8 next, because it gives us a bit of description of what it was like in Susa in the palace. So they were in the enclosed garden of the king's palace in Susa, and the gardens, it says, were dressed with hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. The banquet lasted for 7 days, so I assume there was a lot of wine drunk over that period of time. And they could do as much as they want and have whatever they chose. Now, it was unlawful on pain of death that anyone except the king. So this now leads into the story, combined with this retaliation against the Greeks. This leads into the story of the queen who was already ruling before the time of Esther, which means we find that ushers in the story of Esther. Now, it was unlawful on pain of death that anyone except the king, close relatives and eunuchs who served in the palace were able to see the king's wives or concubines. For this reason, in Esther chapter 1 verse 9, it says, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of Xerxes. So in other words, one was a party for men, and the girls had a party in a separate part of the palace. This is the custom of the time. So on the 7th and last day of the banquet, the king was drunk. Imagine he would be after 7 days of drinking. And he asked the eunuchs who served him to bring his wife before him, wearing her royal crown. He wanted to impress his guests with her beauty. So in Esther chapter 1 verse 12, it reads, But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. So why did she refuse to come? What do you think? The king ordered the queen to come into his presence, and she said, no way. Now, if she refused anything the king ordered, the punishment was actually death in those times. And yet she refused to go. Why did she refuse to go? It's quite a conundrum. What would happen if she did go? She would come into the presence of huge volume of drunk men. So that could be a problem on its own in the natural. But under the law, she actually wasn't allowed to come into the presence of the men. And so if she did go, she would get punished by death. If she doesn't go, then she'll get punished by death. And so she was put in quite a pickle, and this is the story of Queen Vashti. Now, the imperial court of the Persian Empire was made up of a large number of people. The king, of course, was both deemed sacred and the centre of them all. He generally lived a secluded life if he wasn't fighting a war or performing duties at a religious ceremony or state affair. Besides his principal wife and his mother, only the representatives of the noble Persian families were able to see him unannounced. And so this leads into Esther chapter 1, verse 14. It says these were, and it gives a list of names: Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Marries, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media, who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. Now, for those of you who've heard the story that I gave earlier, when King Darius went into power, he joined with 6 other nobles to overthrow the impostor who pretended to be the son of King Cyrus the Great. And so these represents the heads of all of the noble families. And so when we read this scripture, it pays homage to the same 7 noble families. And so the king had several wives and many concubines, but he could only marry women from these noble families. When he asked Queen Vashti, and it says in Esther 1 verse 11, to display her beauty to the people and nobles, he contradicted and violated the law by which she made her decision to refuse, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, this would have caused embarrassment for the king in front of his guests, but she knew if she came into the presence of the large group of drunk men, she not only risked being violated, but she risked committing an offence punishable by death. So Queen Vashti was trapped. Now, if we go to Esther verses 13 to 14, I'm going to read a portion from there in chapter 1. It says, "It was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice. He spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. So King Xerxes asked the 7 nobles." And so reading from verse 15, it says, "According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her." One of the nobles called Memucan replied, but he was more concerned about the effect this may have on his own relationship with his own wives, because the decision of the king reflects on all males and their wives in the kingdom. And so we get a new problem coming out of this. So he has to be quite discerning and delicate about how he answers this, because he doesn't want a ramification for his own family. And so reading from verses 16 to 18, it says, "Queen Vashti has done wrong. Poor lady, if she did one thing, she got punished. She did another thing, she got punished, and they said that she's done wrong, and she couldn't win. Not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, 'King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come.' This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord." And so they're looking at a riot. All the women coming against all the men in the kingdom. And so he's almost not too concerned about the king and his wife. He's worried about what's going to happen to him and his mate's family, and so on and so on. So Memucan recommended the king banish the presence of his queen and give her royal position to another. So in verse 20, it says, "Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest." And so the outcome of this trap that Vashti found herself in, the outcome is that all women will respect their husbands. And so because of the punishment either way, depending on her decision, she couldn't actually respect her husband's wishes because she would have been punished. And so now she gets banished because she can't respect her husband. And so it's a bit of a challenge. And so it's quite a conundrum, isn't it? I wonder if God's hand's on this situation. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? So the king and the other nobles agreed and sent a message throughout the empire to every province, proclaiming every man should rule his own household. And so it's obviously a very male-dominated empire. Okay, so we're going to travel into a little bit of history now, as the Greeks and the Persians come against each other, because the purpose for this whole part of the scripture, the reason the nobles had come together in the first place, was to come together to form a battle plan to go against the Greeks. And so that's the reality of the biblical story at this point. And it also opens the door for looking for a new queen, because Vashti has been banished. So they're the two outcomes of the Bible so far. So King Xerxes set about raising an army from among the many nations that he ruled. And of course, the Bible tells us they were subdivided into 127 provinces. What was one of the provinces? It is a sub-province.
Jerusalem.
Judea. Okay, so Jerusalem in Judea. So what did this mean? It means when the battle was being planned to go against the Greeks and the Persian Empire, the men who were 20 years or older, according to the law, would have been required to go off to war. And so from amongst those men, however many the empire wanted, they would have taken these men and conscripted them to go off and fight on behalf of the Persians against the Greeks. And so the Jewish men became part of the fulfilment of the prophecy that was given through Daniel as well in these early stages. And so there's actually Persian records that reveal that some of the men were actually taken from the sub-province of Judea. So I won't give you the reference, but they exist. So the people of Judea understood that although they lived in the land of their inheritance, and this is the whole point, because King Cyrus released them to go back and build the temple and rebuild Jerusalem, however, they're not free. They're still subject to the rule of a foreign earthly king. And so several strategies have been developed in the plan to punish the Greeks. Later in the same year of 483 BC, King Xerxes began to prepare. Just by the way, you can see how helpful this is for dating the Bible, because these events are happening in history, and yet the actual Bible's telling us that they call these people in, they call them to this time to come together to plan and so forth. So they began to prepare. So he ordered a canal to be dug through the northern Greek peninsula of Athos to avoid another fleet of ships being destroyed, which they'd lost in the previous battle. So I'm going to put this, I'm going to put up this map. We're going to come back to this in a moment, but I just want to show you, this is the canal here. So there's this landmass that came out here, and apparently the weather around here and the way they fought the battles with the way the territory was, they lost all of their ships in the battle here. So in their preparation for this battle, Xerxes had them dig a canal through that landmass, which is where they would travel through in the future. So this was all. So you can see huge preparations. Okay, so provisions were to be stored in various places on the road through Thrace, and 2 pontoon-style bridges were to be built across the Hellespont at Abiud, so his army could cross from the Persian territory into Greece. Now, at this point in time, this was actually called the Sea of, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, of Hell, Helle. Is that how you pronounce it?
I'll run with that.
So, I've got an advisory committee here. Today, what's it called? It's called the Dardanelles. And so this is where the battle was, that the Aussies lost many, many men in World War I. Okay, because they had the Turks on the one side, they tried to access that water to get up into the Black Sea, and of course the Turks caught them there by surprise. Okay, and so the Dardanelles today was called the Sea of Hell. Now it actually says here, and it separates the straits between Asia, so that's here, and what's known as Europe on the other side. So this is Turkey today on this side, Constantinople is just over here, and so there was this here. So it says they built 2 pontoons. So they actually had these floating bridges where they could actually travel across. So quite an extraordinary feat for these ancient times. And so these strategies were aimed at sending a large army, so that's what they were looking at, with naval support to invade Greece. At the New Year's festival in Babylon every year, King Cyrus the Great and King Darius always officiated. One of their duties was to grasp the hands of the statue of Marduk. Well, we've got a problem now because, of course, there's no statue. He's been melted. And they believed that this would ensure continued prosperity through the land of the Babylonians. But since King Xerxes melted this, the outrage to their dignity caused them to boil over. And at the same time, when they were preparing for battle, the Babylonians revolted once again, but King Xerxes crushed the rebellion. So you can see this thing starting to kick off in the empire, which is going to ultimately bring it to its knees. Now, it took 3 years for the Persians to prepare for the conquest of Greece, and King Xerxes moved his army to spend the winter of 480 BC in Sardis. And this is going to come into play when we go back to the story of Esther, because they align with the dates of some of the events that are going on in the Bible. So in the spring he mustered them and set out for this place called Abiud, Mardonius, the son of Gobryas, so he was a Persian noble who helped Darius to claim the throne. So one of the original 7 nobles was the cousin and brother-in-law of the king. And so he set out on the coast and led the Persian fleet to follow the soldiers who were travelling around by land. And so on the map here, you can see here's the land army moving around. The fleet left from here, and they followed them as they travelled across the land to give them naval support. Okay, so this was the planning that happened whilst this banquet occurred in the Bible. So as they marched towards Macedonia, the fleet of ships passed through the canal that I mentioned near the village on the Athos Peninsula before re-entering the sea. Marching through Macedonia, the Persians turned south into Greece until they reached the narrow coastal pass, where they were met by a Greek force of 7,000 men from Greek city-states. A Greek navy led by an Athenian politician and general also sought to block the Persian navy at the Straits of Artemisium. Now in August and September of the same year, a battle called the Battle of Thermopylae raged for 7 days before the Persians defeated the Greeks. So they had a win, and so Themistocles received news that they had lost the pass at Thermopylae before he engaged the Persian navy, so he decided to withdraw his naval forces to the island of Salamis near Athens. The Persians successfully continued south, only to capture and evacuate Athens. They had all left, whose citizens had fled to Salamis, and at this point the Persians had successfully gained control of mainland Greece to the north of the narrow land bridge called the Isthmus of Corinth. So Corinth is a place, of course, that we know from the book of Corinthians with Paul, and so this is located down here. So they came all the way down here and they got to this land bridge. To cut the long story short, they got beaten here, and so the Persians ended up going back home again. Okay, but what this represents is the second time 2 different Persian emperors who came across to fight against the Greeks, had some wins, and then got beaten and went back home again. So what we're seeing again is the early stages of the Greek Empire starting to resist the Persian Empire. So this is the outcome. Okay. So the former king, Darius, and his son Xerxes never set out to conquer Greece, and that's the whole point. They actually were attacked. I don't know if you remember, I mentioned last week, the Greeks actually came across onto the other side of the strait, over to here, which is where the relation of the king was governing from, and they actually attacked them and beat them. And so this was just the response to being attacked. They never actually set to go out against the Greeks. So this is started by the Greeks, Persians came back, Greeks came back, Persians came back, Greeks came back again, and then they went back to their same territories at the end of the day. But the skirmishes were starting to happen. So King Xerxes deemed that he had exacted his revenge in historical records, even though he didn't win, because they see them as stopping them from coming back into Persia. And so he decided at this point in time instead that he would finish several building projects his father had left in Susa and Persepolis. And so we're going to, and so again, all of this is over, and he goes back to building here in Susa and in Persepolis, where his father had been building. The anger King Xerxes had held for Vashti had subsided, and his attendants proposed. So we're going to go back to the biblical record now, to Esther chapter 2, verses 2 to 4. So basically the biblical story tells us they gathered all of the nobles, they went to war against the Greeks, they basically ended up with a battle each way, went back to a statement, he went back home and decided he'd build the palaces instead, and then we return back to this ongoing story. So Esther 2 verses 2 to 4. It says, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." The king was pleased with this advice and he followed it. And so I have some pictures here. I've popped this one up before. This is an artist's impression based on the footprint, and this is today. This is what is left there. They have all of the structural walls and all the surrounds of this ancient palace. In this picture here, this picture was taken in the 1940s. So this is what it's like now, and this is what it's like then. So the excavation work hadn't all been done. Here is the canal that runs through here, and you see this point that's on the top of the map here. This is actually this which I showed you during the time of Daniel when he passed away, because they claim this as the burial site for Daniel. I did also mention the 6 other claims to 6 other sites for the burial site of Daniel, but you can see that peak there, and you can see it right there on the map. So it's right next to Susa. And so this is that footprint. This is the actual palace. And so when we talk about the palace grounds, and we're talking about the party for the queen and all the ladies and the party for the gents, there's many, many buildings here. And this hall down here, they're called an epi-style, I think it's epi-style hall. But they're actually open, there's an open roof there. So this is for all the formal events. But they're actual residences of these other buildings that are further up. So all the guests would have been down in all these lower areas up here. So this is where it was all happening. Now we're going to go to Esther chapter 2 verses 5 to 7 now. And it reads, "Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair." And I'll continue reading from the board. "The son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah." And so we've got this little bit of genealogy going on suddenly in this particular part of the story. And so what they're doing is what? They're connecting the relations, the descendancies, from those who came out of Babylonian exile until the time now with, first of all with Mordecai. And Mordecai, of course, has a cousin who is called Hadassah, who becomes known as Esther. So when we had a look at these 4 things here, what I wanted to ask you is that it says here, the son of Kish, the Kish was the last one. It says that Kish had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim. So we know that he was taken away with Jehoiakim, so the same generation. Okay, so I'll pop his name there. So now I'm going to ask you, who lines up with the next 3? It's in the genealogy of Jesus, the answers for this, but we've been following them descendant by descendant. Who's the son of Jehoiakim that we studied? Does anyone remember his name? It's in the genealogy of Jesus, if you want to have a quick look. But you'll find this alignment between the story in the book of Esther and the genealogy of Jesus. Remember that we're actually on a descendant by the name of Abiud at the moment. And so you'll find that all of these descendants actually align exactly with the genealogy of Jesus. Who's the son of Jehoiakim? Who is the next in the list? Matthew chapter 1. Everyone's been asleep for months. Yeah. Huh? Anyone got it? Begins with S. Next descendant after Jehoiakim in the genealogy of Jesus. Shealtiel. And so, Shealtiel is the same descendant as Shimei that's in this list in the book of Esther. Who's the son of Shealtiel, the next descendant? Zerubbabel. So he's in a line with Jair, who's on this list. And the son of Zerubbabel, whom we're following at the moment in the period of time, is Abiud. And so we see a complete alignment between the genealogy of Jesus that we're following and the descendants that have been put into the book of Esther. Now, the Bible then goes on in verse 7, which we'll read in a moment, to tell us that Mordecai had a younger cousin, and his cousin's name was Hadassah, and then it tells us that her name was called Esther. They use a a name that wasn't so Jewish. Okay? And so we find here that during the time of Abiud, and this is part of the logic that I've used when I've actually done all of the study for the time frame, we find that during the reign of Abiud, that Mordecai and Esther were both alive and doing their thing, which means that the threats that happened to the Jewish people during the time of Mordecai and Esther were applied to the life of Abiud and his family at that point in time. Okay? And so we go to verse 7. It then reads, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So Mordecai, in this situation, he did not act as a kinsman redeemer. So I'm going to ask a question. I know some of you know. Does everyone know what a kinsman redeemer is in the Bible? First of all, what's kin or a kinsman? Right, kin is relatives, isn't it? Family, your kin. Your kith and kin, as they say.
Is that responsible to marry the widow or something like that?
That's part of the laws. So a redeemer is someone who redeems the person that's on their own. So Mordecai's cousin, she lost her parents, and so he took care of her. So the story of Boaz and Ruth, Boaz was a kinsman redeemer, but he married Ruth. Right? We move forwards to the time of Jesus. Joseph married Mary. Joseph was a kinsman redeemer. Okay? And so we find in this situation that Mordecai didn't marry Esther. He obviously had bigger plans for Esther than himself. Okay? So as Jews in Persia's capital Susa, inheritance was not an issue. And so this is the reason why. One of the reasons why we have kinsmen redeemers in the Bible is because everybody who went into the land, the promised land beginning, they were given an inheritance. This is your land. This is where you can grow your crops, have your animals, and support yourself from. That was for every single person that went into the land, but they're not in the land. And so it doesn't apply. And so he doesn't marry her because there's nothing to give her in terms of inheritance. So we sort of have to know some of the original laws from Moses in order to understand the story of Esther here. Now King Xerxes proclaimed his edict, and many girls from throughout the Persian Empire were brought to the palace at Susa and placed in care of Hegai the eunuch. So he's searching for a new wife. Mordecai seized this opportunity to entrust his cousin Esther to Hegai, but when she was taken to the harem of the king, he forbid her to either reveal her nationality or family background. So before Esther could be taken to the king, Esther chapter 2 verse 12 tells us that she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. This wasn't just the practice in this particular palace at this particular time. This was the case for all women that went into harems in ancient rulers. So if you went into the harem of a pharaoh in Egypt, same thing. 12 months, got to wash out all of those bugs, make sure they're all good enough for the pharaoh. But what that's actually happening is actually teaching them all the requirements and the customs. It's not just about giving them endless beauty treatments, it's about making sure that they know exactly what to do when they're in the presence of the emperor. And so they're taught all of these things in this 12-month period. So when Esther's turn came to be taken to the king in the month of Tevet, which is the 10th month of the year, it was winter in the 7th year of his reign. He was attracted to her and she won his approval, so he crowned her and replaced Vashti as the queen of the Persian Empire in 479 BC. Now, the actual wife of this emperor is known. So she's called Queen Vashti in the Bible. Remember, we're writing in the Bible in times of different languages. And so some of the names are different to the historical names. So there's a lady called Amestris Shabanu, who was the daughter of Atans, and he was one of the first of the 7 Persians that actually overthrew the false impostor that tried to take the crown from King Xerxes' son. So these 7 nobles came together, and King Darius I was actually one of them. So it turns out that she was the daughter of one of these gentlemen. So when King Darius died in 486 BC, she was actually married to King Xerxes when he was the crown prince. So many scholars believe that Queen Vashti is that same queen that's in history. Okay? So it's historically recorded. So Esther's older cousin Mordecai, the Bible tells us he always sat at the king's gate, the entrance to the palace. One such time, 2 of the king's officers called Bigthana and Teresh were also present guarding the gate, but in their anger Mordecai overheard them conspiring to kill King Xerxes. So Mordecai, in verse 22 of chapter 2 in the book of Esther, says that he told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. The officers were investigated, and when their intention was found to be true, they were hung. So in the Persian custom, that means they were impaled on a pole. So it was particularly horrific. The deeds of Mordecai were recorded in the yearbook kept by the court scribes in the presence of the king. So Mordecai was not actually rewarded when this took place, but he was recorded, which means he was remembered for what he did. So a threat to the king's life was averted, and it was important to him that the events that took place were recorded in his presence. But what happened as a consequence of him doing that? What did it mean for Esther and Mordecai? What do you think that would mean with the king? What would happen if someone reported to you someone was going to try and kill you? How would you feel towards that person who averted?
Favour you.
They would favour you, they would remember you, they would be thankful to you, but the biggest thing is that they build trust. So in other words, the king would trust their word implicitly because it saved his life. Okay. So after these events, a man named Haman from Agag was promoted to the position of prime minister. So Haman from Agag, does anyone know who this fellow is and why he becomes the enemy of Esther, Mordecai and the Jewish people? Does anyone have any knowledge of this? Haman the Agag. How'd you like to be known as an Agag? So he was an Agagite, basically, as they would say, a person from Agag. An Agagite was actually one of the family members of the Amalekites. Who were the Amalekites?
Jews took them out.
Yes. Therese?
Sorry, what did you say?
I said the Jews took them out.
Oh, they were a tribe, nomadic tribe.
Right. And so why were they...
lived south of, how do you pronounce it? Canaan?
Canaan, yeah.
Yeah.
And what did they do to be an issue today? What did they do back in that time?
They hated the Jews.
They hated the Jews. What did they actually do to the... Well, they weren't Jews in those days, they were known as Israelites. What did they do to them? What was actually happening when the Amalekites had an interface with the Israelites? Does anyone remember? This is a big issue if you're a Jewish person, because all of these hundreds and hundreds of years later, it was still an issue. The Amalekites attacked the exile, the former slaves that came out of Egypt. You remember they were going through the desert, and it says they attacked the tail end of all of the people. And so the Israelites, the then Jews, they never ever forgot this. They deemed that they were the enemy number one. They attacked them and tried to stop them from reaching the promised land. And so this particular fellow is a descendant of those people, and so he becomes enemy number one. So King Xerxes issued a decree ordering all the officials in his service to kneel down to Haman to honour his position, so they did. But Mordecai refused in Esther chapter 3 verse 4 and told them that he was a Jew. So for the first time he mentioned his heritage, who he actually was. And this is why that's significant, because the Jews have this history with the Amalekites, and that's what gets revealed. So the royal officials at the gate asked Mordecai in verse 3 of Esther 3, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" And of course he said, he told them that he was a Jew, because he refused to comply because he was Jewish. Right? So it seems the reasons for these actions might remain unexplained, but when Mordecai told them he was a Jew, the answer was in those words. So Haman the Agagite had descended from Agag, the king of the Amalekites, who was an ancient enemy of the people. If you actually want to look that up, it goes back to 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 to 35. So we've covered this in the past. 1 Samuel 15, verses 1 to 35. So the new Prime Minister Haman was furious at Mordecai's refusal and decided not just to kill him, but to look for a way to kill all Jewish people throughout the Persian Empire. So the years began to slide by until in 474 BC, in the beginning of Nisan, that's March and April in our calendar, Haman called together his diviners to stage a lottery to seek a day in which he could put his evil plan into action. To do this, they cast what was called a pur, P-U-R. And so a pur is a lot. Do you know last week in Israel they celebrated the festival of Purim, as it's called. It's a time when they all get dressed up into different costumes, Spider-Man, Batman, whatever takes their imagination. They run around the streets and they have this big festival. They do it every year. And it's the festival of Purim. And it's actually connected to this very event from this word pur, which means a lot. Okay? So this is a Persian word. And so it fell on the 12th month of Adar, delaying the planned execution of the Jews until the last month of the year. Okay, so that means that the Jews have got a time frame until when they're going to be exterminated. So the Prime Minister then went to his king, and he said in Esther 3, verses 8 to 9, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of other people and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men to carry out this business." If anyone ever comes to you and says, "If it pleases you," and then suggests what you should do, you should probably not listen to it. You notice people say that? If it's okay with you, or if it pleases you, that means that they're going to tell you what they want you to do. And so we see that this is the case back here. Now, again, looking at the value of this fellow offered 10,000 talents of silver. Now that's equivalent to 300,000 kilograms, which today is valued at $159 million. So this guy was a very wealthy guy, and he was willing to put up this money out of his own purse. This is really important because in the story of Esther you learn that she actually inherits his estate. So not only does Esther and Mordecai become very wealthy from this situation, but they get justice. So from this vast sum we can ascertain that Haman was a very powerful player in the kingdom. So King Xerxes refused the money because he's clearly got his statue that he melted down full of gold. So he's got $6.5 billion in his back pocket and doesn't need it. And he gave Haman the signet ring from his finger and told him in verse 11, to do with the people as you please. Of course, the signet ring is a symbol of authority, right? On behalf of the king, he gave him the ring. So that means he shows that ring, he impresses it into a clay stamp, right? And it means that he has the authority of the king to do whatever he pleases. And so on the 13th day of Nisan in 474 BC, Haman had the royal secretaries write in every language to every province in the Persian Empire. The edict was sent out to all the king's provinces, written in his name, with his seal. And in verse 13, it says, with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. And so you can imagine receiving this notification. Mordecai learned what the Prime Minister Haman had done and responded by tearing his clothes, putting on sackcloth and dusting his head with ashes. So he immediately goes into mourning for what is to come. He went out into the city of Susa and wailed loudly in his distress until he reached the king's gate and went no further. So we go back now to Abiud, who's the current descendant in the genealogy of Jesus. You can imagine he's there with his family and all the other people in the province of Judea, and this edict comes into the town. And it gets read to them, and this edict tells them that they're going to be exterminated. Could you imagine? You're at home, knock on the door, you've got 7 months to live, that's it. So you can imagine everybody did what? They all went into mourning. And it actually says in Esther chapter 4 verse 3, it says, "A great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes." So that means all Jewish people throughout the Persian Empire were doing the same. So this includes Abiud and his family. So Queen Esther receives the news from her maids and eunuchs that her cousin Mordecai was deeply distraught, and so she sent him a fresh set of clothes because he's running around in sackcloth and ashes. But what does he do? He refuses to wear them. And she sent one of the king's eunuchs called Hathach to find out what was troubling him. Hathach learned of all what had transpired, and he was told by Mordecai to urge Queen Esther to go to the king, beg for mercy and plead with him to spare her people. Hathach returned and gave Mordecai's answer, but Queen Esther sent a message back. So we're going to read that from Esther 4 verse 11, and it says, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life, but 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." And so again, the laws of the kingdom come into place where you can't approach the king, even if you're the queen. So what happened to Queen Vashti is playing out in a different form now for Queen Esther. So after receiving the queen's message, Mordecai again responded. So verses 13 to 14 of chapter 4, it says, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this." And so Mordecai basically says, Queen Esther, you are not immune from this command. You too will be brought to your end and your family. And so that now challenges her in her position of power, where she's now got to think very, very hard about what in fact is she going to do. So what we're actually seeing here is what we're seeing, the faith of Queen Esther being challenged. Right? What does she do? Does she pretend nothing's happening, she's in the palace, she's okay? Or does she stand and act for her people? And if she stands and acts for her people, she now has to reveal her true identity to the king, which she hasn't done on the instruction of Mordecai. And so things are starting to come apart at the seams a bit. So she responded to Mordecai's request by putting her own mortality before that of her people. But when Mordecai suggested it was probably only by God's providence that she became queen, the very purpose for this confronted her in this moment. So he's suggesting now that you are actually made for such a time as this. What are you going to do? Are you going to stand for God and your people, or are you going to stand for yourself? So she's issued a challenge. So Queen Esther again replies in verse 16 of chapter 4, "Go, gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 nights, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." And so we see once again something of the story of Nehemiah, when he was first told by Hanani, his brother, that the city of Jerusalem was unprotected. Right? So what do? They fast, they mourn, and they pray. So in other words, the message here is before we do anything, because we're literally going to break these earthly laws, we're going to pray to our God in heaven, and we're going to ask him to come in amongst this situation and protect us against this earthly ruler. And so the first time that the news went out, everybody in the Persian Empire fasted and prayed and went into mourning. But now she's specifically asking them, the people in Susa, to fast and pray fast and pray. What does it say? Fast and pray, sorry. So she's asking them to fast and pray for her this time, specifically for her approaching the king. So Mordecai went and did as she said, and on the third day Queen Esther went to the king, and what does the Bible tell us? He held out his scepter for her to touch, which means she was safe. She was allowed to approach the king. And so the scepter is the rod that gets held by a king. So King Xerxes asked Queen Esther what is it that she wanted, and she invited him and the Prime Minister Haman to a banquet. He agreed, and when they were seated and drinking wine, the king asked her what she wanted. And so she answers in verses 7 to 8 of chapter 5. So moving to chapter 5 now, verses 7 to 8. She says, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favour, and if it pleases the king," there's that pleases the king again, "to grant my petition and fulfil my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I'll prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's questions." So she's foxing. She's not giving a direct answer. So the king agreed, and they parted company. Haman left feeling privileged and happy because he was the prime minister, and he was going to dine exclusively with the king and the queen. But when he passed Mordecai at the king's gate and was shown no fear nor courtesy, he became furious. He went home and gathered his friends together with his wife Zeresh, and boasted of his position and wealth before telling them in Esther 5 verses 12 to 13, "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." And so he's really got it in for him. His wife and friends suggest that he builds a gallows, it says in Esther 5 verse 14, 75 feet high, which is approximately 23 metres in modern terms, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it, then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. Haman did as they suggested, and when he had the beams built so high, he wanted Mordecai's corpse to be seen from a great distance to terrify and warn any others who refused to honour his pride, which is what this is all about. So that same night, as Haman planned the execution of Mordecai, King Xerxes, however, could not sleep, the Bible tells us. He asked for the yearbook. So if you ever can't fall asleep at night, just get a yearbook from something, from an encyclopedia, and start reading, and it'll help you go to sleep. So he asked for the yearbook where the records of his reign was kept to be brought to him and read. Probably fluff his own pride up, I guess. As the book of the Chronicles were being read, the record of Mordecai was found when he exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh to kill the king. So in Esther chapter 6 now, moving through the scriptures, verse 3, it says, "What honour and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. And so we see here that the providential hand of God is at work. The king could not sleep, and the record of Mordecai's unrewarded services were read the night before his intended execution. So let's see what happened. So the next morning, Haman went to the king's court to speak about hanging Mordecai. I'm sorry, I have a lovely picture of Esther here in the background in the Persian palace. I just realised I haven't put that up. So the next morning, Haman went to the king's court to speak about hanging Mordecai. But when the king's attendants ushered him, he was asked in verse 6 of Esther 6, what should be done for the man who the king delights to honour? And thinking the king was referring to himself, he doesn't have much of an ego, this fellow, Haman replies in verses 7 to 9 of chapter 6, for the man the king delights to honour, have them bring a royal robe. He obviously thinks it's about himself. Have him bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head, just in case they don't know it's royal. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man with the king delights to honour, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honour.' So the king commanded Haman to get the horse and the robe, go to the king's gate where Mordecai sat, and do everything he suggested. Haman did as he was told, because if he refused the king's order, what would happen to him? He would be punished by death. And so his pride was pretty big, but he still wanted to stay alive. Not going to work very well though. So Haman did as he's told and led Mordecai on the king's horse, wearing the king's robe, around the city streets of Susa. So we have another lovely illustration here of him being led around. Sorry, just find my place here. So after they were finished, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, and Haman raced home with his head covered. Awash with grief, Haman's advisors and wife said to him in verse 13 of chapter 6, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Interesting comment, isn't it? This is his wife, because he's of Jewish origin. Now, hadn't a decree just been issued throughout the empire to say that every Jew was to be killed? And so he came against Mordecai, and now his wife flips the coin and says, hang on, you came against a Jewish person. That was a bad mistake. In fact, the words say you cannot stand against him. And so we find that this whole situation has turned on its head. But before they finished talking, the king's eunuchs arrived to take Haman to the banquet prepared by Queen Esther. It's quite a delightful biblical story, isn't it? So drinking wine with Haman and the queen, King Xerxes asked in Esther chapter 7 now, verse 2, to chapter 7 verse 2, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you." So in other words, he promises it before he even knows what it is. "What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." So he obviously loves Esther very much. So the queen petitioned for her life and requested that her people be spared. So at this point in time, she's declaring her Jewish origin. So she explains in Esther 7 verse 4, "For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation." So the connection's made there to the edict for the Jewish people. So the king asked who and where was the man who dared to do this, and she answered in verse 6, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman sitting across the table from them." So you can imagine how Haman's feeling right now. So the king was furious, and he left the banquet hall to go out into the palace garden. Haman stayed and fell on the couch where Queen Esther sat to beg for his life. And when King Xerxes returned, he exclaimed in verse 8, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" Because obviously it's inappropriate for him to approach the queen on the couch. And so this is what he finds when he comes back in. So his anger is rising. So as the king finished speaking, the king's eunuchs covered the face of Haman. One of these attendants, called Harbona, had heard of the structure built near Haman's home and said to the king in verse 9 of Esther chapter 7, "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." So he's now firmly placing himself on the side of the queen. And the king says, "Hang him on it." And so it was that the place of execution planned for Mordecai became the place of death for Haman, right next to his home, in full display for his wife, his children, and his servants to see. The man who sought evil to stop the promise, and this is what it's about, to stop the promise of God's covenant being fulfilled, met his end by the faith, and that's the word, the faith of Queen Esther, because she had to actually go against the laws of the land, and the righteousness of her cousin Mordecai. So the petition for Queen Esther's life had been fulfilled, but now there's a greater problem ahead of them. If the edict that Haman had sent through the Persian Empire in the king's name was not changed, all Jewish people throughout the empire would still be annihilated. So this, of course, included Abiud, who we're following in the descendancy, and Abiud is a person who has no story in the Bible, but if he wasn't alive, there would be no Jesus Christ the Messiah. And so each of these nameless people serve a purpose in God's plan. If he was killed, the prophecy of the coming Messiah would not be fulfilled. And so King Xerxes gave Haman's very wealthy estate to Queen Esther, and he gave his signet ring to Mordecai. The queen appointed her cousin over Haman's estate and then pleaded with the king in Esther chapter 8 now, verse 5. Let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all of the king's provinces. The king told Queen Esther and Mordecai to write a new decree in the king's name that best suited them, and then seal it with the irrevocable authority of the signet ring. This they did, and the royal secretaries were summoned to the 23rd day of the 3rd month of Sivan to write, it says in Esther 8 verse 9, Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. The dispatches were sent out by mounted couriers riding fast horses throughout the empire. Just about to wrap up. In the sub-province of Judea, in the small town of Bethlehem, news of the new edict. So you can imagine all these people, they're all mourning, they're in their sackcloth with their ashes on their head, and suddenly a courier rides into town with a new edict issued by the Persian king. 2 months of mourning, weeping and fasting had passed by this stage, and obviously it would have been challenging all of their faith. Now the edict we read in Esther 8 verse 11 to 12. So Esther 8 verse 11 to 12 granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves. And so this is very powerful because it actually gives them authority within the kingdom which they didn't actually have before. It says it gives them the right to assemble but also to protect themselves, to destroy, kill and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. And so this is the festival of Purim that's celebrated in modern times, when they actually come together to remember how Esther protected all of their people. And so praise God, Abiud's prayers and all the rest of the Jewish people had been answered. He no longer had to fear the neighbours who wanted them gone. And on the 14th day, it says in Esther chapter 9, verse 17, that he and everyone else rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. And so that brings us to a conclusion tonight. So there's a little bit more to go in the book of Esther, but the essence of what actually happened, it sort of has to be told in one piece. The assembly of all the people in the beginning of the book of Esther is because of the planned war with the beginning of the Greek Empire starting to rise, and the balance of the story is about the protection of the Jewish people from their mortal enemy, which goes right back in biblical history to the time of the Amalekites, when they attacked the Israelites leaving Egypt after their time of slavery. And so at this point in time, we see that, as we see in the Bible, every time something comes against God's people, they end up being empowered with something that they weren't empowered with before. And so we find here that they now have the means to protect themselves and in fact go out against those who would come against them. And so you can imagine today in the state of Israel, when people come against them, they feel they completely have the right to go out and to protect themselves against anyone who would come against them. And of course we can see here in the story, if we look at it from God's perspective, the big picture story here is that Queen Esther was appointed onto this throne for a time such as this, because it had to be someone who would have the ear of the king and the power to stop this fellow from annihilating the Jewish people. Okay, so let's just pop up this end screen. So we've been broadcasting from Facebook live, so you can watch this back on Facebook. You can go to our YouTube channel, type in Paul Brunton, the Jesus Movement. You can become a subscriber and watch the high definition videos, and also on the website, thejesusmovement.com.au. So thank you for joining us. We look forward to your company next time. God bless you.